Welcome to week 2 of our Journeys of Paul. This is yet another attempt to get a video introduction for you. Like I did last time, I'll put some opening or some questions for you on the table to get your discussion started after I give you this little mini lecture. Someone has already made fun of me that last time I told you I'd do 5 to 10 minutes, and I ended up going for 20. And you should just know that my default is about 20 minutes, but I'm going to try to keep it shorter today. All right, so I've put the map back up because I want to remind ourselves of Paul as a human being, that he lived in a time and space where he did not have cars or trains or airplanes. He had to take boats, walk, maybe take a horse over the course of what was the then known world of the Roman Empire. So he was all over that Mediterranean area. So if you remember 2 weeks ago, I talked about the way Paul had multiple worlds. So he had his Jewish world. He was brought up, he trained as a rabbi. If you go and read rabbinic literature from the first centuries and Second Temple Judaism, you're going to find a world that feels very much like Paul. But he also was raised in Tarsus in a time when the cultures were colliding and intermingling. So he knew his Greco-Roman philosophy, he knew his Greco-Roman culture, and he was all kind of up in that. So he was the kind of person who could walk into a room and speak Greek, and then walk into another room and speak Aramaic. And get along fine with both groups of people. So he's got this kind of cross-cultural ability. So just to remember that this is a complicated person with a complicated background. So what I thought would be fun for us to do today, like I said when I pitched this idea, is I wanted to use Acts to kind of structure us going into the letters. And I thought today it would be really fun to kind of draw out these 4 points that Paul was zealous for the law. That is something associated with Pharisaic Judaism in the first century. So being zealous. And then how he's converted by Jesus himself, and that big conversion story, which he's going to tell 2 other times in Acts. And then there's this kind of inter-Christian discussion and argument that peaks in Acts 15, and Paul is caught up in that. And then Paul's caught up in kind of conflicts with Rome, and it's not just with Rome, it's more with like the political powers of the time. So I thought these are 4 things, and there are more, but these 4 things kind of show up in Acts. And I thought what would be fun and interesting would be to kind of go and look at a particular place in Acts, and then to they'll go and find Paul talking about something very similar in his letters, just to help us see here at the beginning, before we dive into the letters themselves, to kind of see that the person that we kind of see kind of wandering through the Roman Empire in Acts is actually at least very close to the person that we're going to see his personality in his letters. And just think, like, we don't have that many people who have written these amount of letters for us to kind of read their internal thoughts from history. Right? We have, I mean, more after the printing press, but back then, like, Paul's an outlier. We have an awful lot of his thoughts on paper. And so I just kind of want to kind of explore, how is the picture we see in Acts similar to the picture we see in his letters. So we're going to start with him being zealous for the law. Again, this is something that is associated with Pharisaic Judaism in the first century. They wanted to be very zealous. So here's Acts 8. The Bibles are on the shelf. I'm using a different translation, but I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to maybe pause this and go get the Bibles off the shelf. And I'll put these texts on the handout that I'm going to put on the table. Saul began to wreak havoc against the church. Entering one house after another, he would drag off both men and women and throw them into prison. So this is that zealous Pharisee, the person who is so intense about keeping the law that he is actually going and arresting people and throwing them in for what we would think of now as heresy. Now, it's very easy to kind of get mad at him about this, but I had a student years ago taking a Bible's literature class, and we got to the Pharisees in the Gospels, and of course, we had at that point read the entirety of the Old Testament, when God is saying through the prophets, stop worshiping idols, start taking care of the poor, start following the rules I've given you. And they get sent to exile, and then they come back, and the Pharisees are now the ones trying to take care of the poor, and they're trying to keep God's law as best as they can, so much so that they draw boundaries around it to make sure they don't accidentally break the law. And my student said, so finally, the Jewish people have learned the lesson from the Old Testament, and Jesus comes along and says, just kidding, do it this other way. Of course they got mad at him, she said. Of course they killed him. And she had gotten at the heart of what's going on in Scripture, is that there is a tremendous PTSD in the Jewish people at the time that Paul and Jesus are walking the earth, because they have witnessed the fall of their temple being destroyed. They have come back. A second temple has been built, but God hasn't come back to fill that temple with God's presence. And then the Persians who let them come back got taken over by the Greeks, and then the Greeks got taken over by the Romans, and these people never got their land back. So there is a PTSD. So Paul is trying zealously to uphold the law. He says the same thing about himself in Galatians. You heard about my previous life in Judaism, he says, how severely I harassed God's church and tried to destroy it. And so here he is admitting the problem, and Galatians is one of those places where we get him kind of telling us his autobiography, and it chimes very well with what we learn in Acts, which was written by Luke. And we know from Luke and in Acts that he traveled with Paul, because there are these delightful moments where the narrative changes, and rather than saying, and Paul did this, it would switch and go, and when we got on the boat here. And so we get the first person plural, so we know that the writer Luke was with Paul in these moments. So here's Paul admitting what he had been like. He did everything he could. He was zealous to try to keep the faith, his faith at the time, and so much so that he was ready to destroy the church. I've chosen the artwork on the side because I like this idea of Paul sitting there thinking real hard about the scriptures, because that is what our next thing is going to have forced him to do, and that is that he is converted by Jesus. So even in his later letters, and I don't quote this, but even in his letters, he talks about how in the Corinthian correspondence, he is the last of the apostles called. And he does that because he doesn't have the standard call. He was not there when Jesus walked the earth. He was not there when Jesus was raised from the dead. And he's very clear about the fact that those people existed, and he is separate from them. So he's clear about that in his letters. And here you get what it takes for Jesus to get his attention during the journey. So he's going out to do some more searching houses and arresting people. As he approached Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven encircled him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice asking him, Saul, Saul, why are you harassing me? Saul asked, Who are you, Lord? I am Jesus whom you are harassing, came the reply. Now get up and enter the city. You will be told what you must do. So this is a very dramatic moment in Scripture, and oftentimes we think of it as like what conversions should look like. But the reason I have it as second is because like Jesus doesn't change his personality. It's not like he goes from being a zealous Pharisee to being kind of, just like a fun go lucky guy who like wanders around and hangs out in bars with people. He goes to being a zealous Christian who is going across the world on boats, suffering shipwrecks and all sorts of things to carry the gospel that God has saved both Jews and Gentiles. He goes and does this with the exact zeal he did as a Pharisee. This reminds me the name Saul. If you think back to the fact that he's in this kind of intercultural world, Saul would have been a very Jewish name. If you think about Saul the king, the first king of Israel, right before David, so that's a Jewish name. But then he has this Greek name, Paulus, Paul. And so a lot of people would have had those two names as they go back and forth between cultures. So that is probably why we get him as Saul at the beginning. And then as he moves into the Gentile world, he goes by Paul. So he goes by a Greek name instead of a Jewish name. So here he is on his conversion. And then he's going to tell us in Galatians a similar story. God was pleased to reveal his son to me so that I might preach about him to the Gentiles. Now, this section in Galatians is Paul talking about how he didn't receive the gospel from humans. He received it from God himself. He received this message from Jesus. And that becomes a very big point for him, because he goes up and he talks to the apostles, but he received this revelation from Jesus himself, which means that he's received it from heaven, that the Gentiles need to be included in with the Jewish people, without circumcision. So this is part of his argument. And again, less dramatic than what we get in Acts, but it's a very similar story. He's reminding them, I wasn't a Christian, and Jesus found me. God revealed his son to me so that I could go out and preach the gospel. So again, I'm just trying to help us see the letters and Acts kind of chime together. To bring us to our third point, this kind of tension among the apostles. It's not that they fought and disagreed. That's why I include this artwork here, which is that it's Peter and Paul arguing over a text together. And I love this. And at the Vatican in Rome, there's an image of Peter and Paul because these are the two kind of pillars of Christianity, these two apostles who argued and fought. So we get this moment, and I told you about Acts 15, where there was the council in Jerusalem where they needed to discuss how they dealt with the Gentiles. And Paul and Barnabas come and they give a full report about everything that God's been doing. They argue about how God is letting the Spirit fall on the Gentiles, even though the Gentiles haven't been circumcised. So then you get some of the Pharisees who are Christians standing up and saying, nope, they must be circumcised. They got to be required to keep the law of Moses. And at this point, Peter and James side with Paul and Barnabas. And so they write a letter that says, you don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to follow the law. The things you do is abstain from sexual immorality, and you don't eat food sacrificed to idols. And that is the limit of what the apostles put on the Gentiles. And so this is this moment of like very heated disagreement. But again, you have Paul and Peter kind of coming together and agreeing. But then Paul tells us a story that it wasn't always so clean and neat. And again, this is in Galatians. When Cephas, so that means rock, so that's Peter. When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. I apologize for that typo. Because he was wrong. He separated himself from the Gentile Christians when Jewish Christians arrived. So the scenario is this: they're all eating together. Peter's hanging out with the Jews, with the Gentiles, just like Paul is. But then Jewish Christians come from Jerusalem, and Peter steps back and separates himself from the Gentile Christians to sit with the Jewish Christians, because presumably those Jewish Christians would not sit with the Gentiles because they were considered unclean. And Paul calls him out on it and says, we were all saved by grace, so you better get over here and sit with these Gentiles because they are equal to us, even though they have not been circumcised. So again, there's this friction that's going on in Acts because they're trying to figure out what they do with Gentiles, and that spills over into the apostles. But eventually, Peter and Paul, the two big guys, kind of come to an agreement. And so the conflict settles, but you really have to have it. Basically, the whole of the New Testament is, what do we do about Gentiles now that we think they were saved in Jesus? So that kind of erupts to the surface. So this brings me to the fourth point that we see in Acts, which is that Paul, everywhere he goes, really ticks off the political powers, in particular Rome. So I love this story in Acts. Like he says the gods made of human hands aren't really gods. So in Ephesus, people are like, he's taken away our money because we sell these little statues for a lot of money. And then later on in Acts 17, he actually casts out a demon from a girl. And it is this basically it's this demon that tells people's fortunes, and so they realize that now they don't have their money, and they come bringing Paul to have him arrested, saying these people who have been turning the world upside down have come here also. So they grapple in Acts with the fact that the gospel is a direct threat against the political powers of Rome and the political powers of the Jewish parties who have political power. And so this is a really interesting thing, that the gospel is like flying in the face of Roman culture. And we see this kind of all over the place. So this one, I have a quote, but I want to say for a second a couple of things. We have Paul's letter to Philemon, where he is asking him to release a slave. There's another very similar letter written by a non-Christian who has very different advice. Paul's feeling about slaves is not at all what the feeling of the Roman Empire was. Paul's feeling about women, not at all what the Roman Empire was, because the Roman Empire did not think that they were women. Paul called some of them apostles and prophets. So like he had categories for women to have positions of power. That is not at all how the Roman Empire thought. Paul thought children were people. The early Christians took care of poor people. They took care of everybody because it didn't matter who you were. God loved you. And that shows up throughout Paul's letters, less as a quotable thing and more of like an underpinning underneath them about how every human being is worthy of dignity and respect, as we in the Episcopal Church are fond of saying. So the one quote I have from you here is how he actually recontextualizes what these Gentile Christians in Corinth are. He says, "You know, when you were Gentiles, you were often misled by false gods that can't even speak." And so here we catch a glimpse of what is underneath Paul's theology, which is these Gentiles are no longer considered by Paul to be Gentiles. That is how grafted into God's people they are. They have now become, by all intents and purposes for Paul, Jewish people. They used to be Gentiles, but they become Jewish people without having to have circumcision or taking on Torah. This is radical. It flies in the face of everything that people were thinking before Paul. And it all happens because Paul was converted by Jesus himself. And that zealousness, so here are our 4 points for today again. That zealousness, that zeal, there's the word, that zeal that Paul had gets refocused, turned almost 180 degrees in a different direction towards talking about Gentiles, towards talking about how Jesus has saved the Gentiles. That brings tensions among the apostles. Even though Peter himself had seen the Holy Spirit fall on Gentiles, there's these tensions because that's how difficult it was to reckon with the world being this radical and this new, because they have to realize what happened in Jesus is continuous fully with the whole story going all the way back to Adam through Abraham and Moses. The story is continuous, and yet what has just happened in Jesus is brand new. It's going to cause us to rethink literally everything, which means that we can now call a person who is not circumcised Jewish. That when they were Gentiles, they used to worship idols, but now they worship the one God. And once you do that, you start to shake the foundations of the political world, and that gets you into trouble, such that Paul ends up getting martyred. Peter ends up getting martyred. Best we can tell, all of the apostles got martyred, except for maybe the guy who wrote the gospel according to John. But we're not talking about him, we're talking about Paul. So I'm going to close down now. There's going to be some discussion questions on the table. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you feel like you've learned something. I hope it's given you a lot to talk about. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. Next week when I'm there, we're going to pick up with reading the letters. All right. I'll talk to you later.